The desert sun had turned vicious by noon, transforming the wooden fence posts into branding irons that scorched human flesh without mercy. 3 figures sagged against the weathered planks outside Dust Creek, a woman heavy with child, her swollen belly straining against fabric torn by cruel hands, and 2 small girls whose tears had long since evaporated in the merciless heat. "Parasites will not be tolerated," proclaimed the crude sign, hammered above their heads, its letters carved deep with the righteous fury of men who believed themselves servants of justice. Nadine Hartwell's dark hair clung to her fevered face like wet rope, her wrists rubbed raw and bleeding from the coarse hemp that bound her to the post. Beside her, 10-year-old Sylvie pressed her thin body against her mother's arm, trying desperately to shield 6-year-old Opal from the pitiless stares of the gathered crowd. The little one's lips had cracked like dried clay, her breath coming in shallow pants that spoke of fever setting in. "Mama Soma." Opal whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of satisfied spectators. "The thirsty hurts so bad." The townspeople of Dust Creek watched with the peculiar satisfaction of those who believed they were witnessing divine retribution. Men removed their hats and nodded solemnly. Women clutched their own children closer, and even the dogs seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. This was justice, they told themselves. This was what happened to those who harbored thieves and spread lies about honest lawmen. Sheriff Knox stood prominent among the crowd, his star catching the brutal light like a beacon of authority. At 45, he ruled Dust Creek through a careful mixture of fear and respect, his weathered face carved from the same unforgiving stone as the desert mountains. Knox had built his reputation on swift justice and unwavering moral certainty, and this public display was his masterpiece, a lesson that would echo through the territory for years to come. But one man at the crowd's edge stood frozen in place, his scarred hands trembling as memories crashed over him like flash floodwaters. Abel Thorne's mind had snapped back 15 years to another woman, another child, another moment, when courage might have changed everything. The phantom weight of small arms around his neck growing cold despite his desperate prayers made his chest seize with the familiar agony of failure. In his shirt pocket, pressed against his ribs like a talisman, lay Sarah's wooden knife, the one he'd carved for his wife during their brief season of happiness. He'd whittled it from mountain oak while she watched pregnant with their first child, her eyes bright with dreams of the family they'd raised together. The knife was all he had left of that time, found only recently in a pawn shop after years of searching. He'd carried it everywhere since, a reminder of love lost and chances squandered. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in the desert wind. "Sometimes Abel doing nothing is the greatest sin of all." Not again, never again. Abel pushed through the crowd, ignoring the hostile murmurs that followed his movement. Knox's voice rose in sharp warning, but Abel's calloused fingers were already working at the knots, binding Nadine's wrists, his movements quick and sure, despite the tremor in his hands. "Step away, Thorne." Knox barked, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "These criminals ain't your concern." The pregnant woman's eyes fluttered open, confusion mixing with desperate hope as she felt the ropes loosen. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, sensing drama about to unfold. Abel's gray eyes met Knox's without flinching, and his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd already lost everything that mattered. "They're my concern now." The sheriff's face darkened with rage. "You're interfering with lawful punishment, Thorne. That makes you an accessory to their crimes." "What crimes?" Abel's hands moved to untie Sylvie's bonds. "Being hungry, being widowed, being too weak to fight back. You harboring a known thief, spreading malicious lies about respected citizens, vagrancy and public disturbance." Knox's voice grew louder, playing to the crowd. Thomas Hartwell stole 50 head of cattle before he ran off like the coward he was, leaving his family to face the consequences of his actions. Abel saw the flash of pain in Nadine's eyes, the way Sylvie's small jaw tightened with suppressed fury. Whatever the truth about Thomas Hartwell, these three had already suffered enough. Then charge them proper, Abel said, lifting Opal's limp form in his arms. The child was burning with fever, her breathing shallow and labored. Take them before a judge, let them defend themselves according to law. I am the law in Dust Creek, Knox replied coldly. And the law says parasites get what they deserve. Abel settled the sick child more securely in his arms, feeling the terrible heat radiating from her small body. Then maybe it's time for a new law. The crowd stirred uneasily, sensing the challenge in Abel's words. Some nodded agreement. There were still decent people in Dust Creek who remembered what justice looked like. But others grumbled their support for Knox, unwilling to see their comfortable certainties questioned. You're making a mistake, Thorne, Knox said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. One you'll regret. I've made plenty of mistakes, Abel replied, helping Nadine to her feet while Sylvie supported her from the other side. But this ain't one of them. As they walked away from the fence, Abel felt the weight of hostile stares following them. Knox wouldn't let this public humiliation stand. The sheriff's authority depended on fear and respect, and Abel had just undermined both in front of the entire town. But for the first time in 15 years, Abel Thorne felt something approaching peace. Sarah's wooden knife pressed warm against his chest, and he could almost hear her voice. That's my Abel. That's the man I married. The reckoning would come as surely as the desert sun would rise tomorrow. But today, 3 innocent lives had been saved from cruel injustice. Today, courage had triumphed over cowardice. It would have to be enough. The abandoned Thorne Ranch squatted 3 miles outside Dust Creek, like a monument to dreams deferred and hopes buried. Abel had built every board with his own hands 15 years ago, each nail-driven with love for the wife who designed the layout and the children they'd planned to raise in its rooms. The house sat solid and square against the desert, built to withstand sandstorms and flash floods, Indian raids, and the casual violence of frontier life. Now it stood as hollow as Abel's heart, home to nothing but ghosts and the accumulated dust of too many empty years. He settled Nadine Hartwell in Sarah's rocking chair, the one piece of furniture he'd never been able to bring himself to burn or sell. The chair had been Sarah's pride, carved from cherry wood by her father back in Missouri, shipped west at considerable expense when they decided to make their fortune in the silver boom. She'd spent countless hours in that chair, hands busy with needlework or cradling their baby daughter, humming songs that spoke of hope and contentment. The pregnant woman's fever was finally breaking after hours of careful tending, but exhaustion weighed her shoulders like a physical burden. Her dark hair hung limp around a face that might have been beautiful before hardship carved away the softness. Still, there was strength in the set of her jaw, determination in the way she held herself upright, despite obvious pain and weakness. Sylvie sat rigid on the porch steps, her young face turned toward the horizon, where heat waves danced above the desert floor. At 10 years old, she carried herself with the wariness of someone who'd learned too young that adults couldn't be trusted, that safety was temporary, and kindness often came with hidden costs. Her eyes, dark like her mother's, held depths that spoke of wisdom earned through suffering. Little Opal lay curled on a pile of blankets Abel had arranged in the shade, her fever-flushed cheeks a stark contrast to the pallor of serious illness. The child's breathing had steadied somewhat, but she remained unconscious, lost in the burning maze of fever dreams. Abel had seen enough childhood sickness to know she was fighting for her life. "Why'd you help us?" Sylvie asked suddenly, her voice carrying the hard edge of a child who'd been disappointed too many times. "What do you want from us?" Abel knelt beside the water bucket, wringing out a cloth in the tepid water. At 42, his hair had gone prematurely silver, and deep lines mapped the geography of sorrow around his eyes. His hands, scarred from years of hard work and harder living, moved with gentle precision as he placed the cool cloth on Opal's forehead. Because it was the right thing to do, he said simply. Most folks don't seem to care much about right and wrong. Sylvie observed her tone bitter beyond her years. Most folks are afraid. Abel settled back on his heels, studying the girl's face. Fear makes cowards of good people, and Knox's built his power on keeping folks scared. And what about you? Ain't you afraid of what Knox might do? Abel's hand moved unconsciously to his shirt pocket where Sarah's wooden knife rested like a talisman. Fear was his constant companion, fear of failing again, of watching someone else die because he wasn't strong enough, fast enough, good enough. The nightmares still came regularly, dreams where he arrived home to find Sarah and little Mary burning with fever, calling his name, while he stood helpless and paralyzed. No, terrified, he admitted quietly. But I learned something important 15 years ago. Fear ain't an excuse to stand by and do nothing. Sometimes doing nothing is the greatest sin of all. Sylvie studied him with those two old eyes, weighing his words against her experience of adult promises and betrayals. What happened 15 years ago? The question hit like a physical blow, driving the air from Abel's lungs. He closed his eyes, seeing again the crude grave markers he'd carved with shaking hands. Hearing again the silence that had greeted his return from a bounty hunt that had taken him away for 5 crucial days. I had a family once, he said finally. Wife named Sarah, daughter named Mary. They died while I was away chasing money. Fever took them both in the space of 2 days. I came home to find them buried in the yard, nothing left but graves, and the echo of my own failures. The girl's expression softened slightly, recognizing the weight of genuine grief. I'm sorry. Point is, I failed them when they needed me most. Been carrying that guilt ever since, wondering if I could have saved them, if I'd been here, if I'd made different choices. Abel's voice grew stronger, more certain. But I can't change the past. All I can do is try to make better choices now. Nadine stirred in the rocking chair, her eyes opening to focus on the conversation. Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice hoarse but steady. You don't owe us anything. We're grateful for what you've done, but we won't be charity cases. Didn't figure you would be, Abel replied. But you're here now, and that little girl needs medical attention. We'll worry about the rest when she's better. As if summoned by his words, Opal's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. Mama, she whispered. Nadine was at her side, instantly smoothing damp hair back from her daughter's forehead. I'm here, baby. You're safe now. Where are we? With a friend, Nadine said, glancing at Abel with something that might have been gratitude. Someone who helped us when we needed it most. Abel stood and moved to the window, watching the desert for signs of movement. Knox wouldn't let this public humiliation stand. The sheriff's authority depended on fear and respect, and Abel had just undermined both in front of the entire town. It was only a matter of time before Knox made his move. There's something you need to know, Nadine said quietly. About my husband. About why Knox really had us tied to that fence. Abel turned back to face her, seeing the pain and determination warring in her expression. I'm listening. Thomas didn't steal any cattle, Nadine said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He found evidence that Knox was the one doing the stealing. That's why he's dead, and that's why Knox wants us silenced. The words hung in the air, like smoke from a distant fire, carrying the promise of danger and the scent of truth. Abel felt the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to shift into place, forming a picture that was both clearer and more terrifying than he'd imagined. Tell me everything, he said. Outside, the sun was setting in a blaze of red and gold, painting the desert in shades of blood and fire. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled wild and free and unafraid. Once Abel had envied that wildness. Now he wondered if he was about to discover what it felt like to be truly free. Or truly doomed. Night had settled over the desert like a black blanket studded with silver stars, when Nadine finally found the strength to tell her story. Opal was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, her fever broken and her breathing steady. Sylvie sat cross-legged on the floor beside her sister, one protective hand resting on the child's shoulder even in sleep. The oil lamp cast dancing shadows across the cabin walls as Nadine began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute truth. My Thomas was a good man, Mr. Thorne, honest to a fault, which is probably what got him killed. She paused, her hands clenching in her lap. He worked at the stockyard, keeping the books for cattle sales. Been doing it for 3 years, ever since we came to Dust Creek, looking for a fresh start. Abel poured coffee from the pot that had been simmering on the stove, offering a cup to Nadine before settling into the chair across from her. What kind of fresh start? We'd lost our farm back in Kansas. Drought took the crops 2 years running, and the bank took everything else. Thomas heard there was work in the Silver Territories, honest work for honest men. Her laugh was bitter as alkali dust. Shows how much we knew about the world. Knox wasn't always corrupt, Abel said. When he first came to Dust Creek, he seemed like a decent enough lawman. Maybe a little too quick with his gun, but fair in his dealings. Power changes people, Nadine replied. Or maybe it just reveals who they really were underneath. She sipped her coffee, gathering strength for what came next. 3 weeks ago, Thomas came home all excited. Said he'd been going through the stockyard ledgers trying to reconcile some discrepancies when he noticed something strange. What kind of discrepancies? Cattle being sold that weren't recorded in the books. Money changing hands that never appeared in the official records. At first, Thomas thought it was just sloppy bookkeeping. The previous clerk was known to take a drink now and then. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized it was deliberate. Abel leaned forward, sensing they were approaching the heart of the matter. Knox was skimming from the cattle sales. Worse than that. Knox was stealing entire herds, changing the brands, and selling them through contacts in other territories. The money was going into his personal accounts, not the town treasury. Nadine's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if telling the truth was giving her back some measure of power. Thomas figured Knox had stolen close to $50,000 over the past 2 years. The number hit Abel like a physical blow. $50,000 was a fortune in this territory, enough to buy a small town or corrupt an entire county. No wonder Knox had been living so well, building that big house on the hill and traveling to San Francisco on official business. Thomas had proof. A ledger showing every fraudulent transaction, every forged document, every stolen head of cattle. He was so excited, Mr. Thorne. Said we were finally going to see justice done, finally going to watch an honest-to-God criminal face the consequences of his actions. Abel felt ice forming in his stomach. Let me guess, he decided to confront Knox directly. I begged him not to. Told him to take the evidence to the territorial marshal in Santa Fe, let the federal authorities handle it. But Thomas was an idealist. Believed in the goodness of people even when they'd given him no reason to. Tears began to track down Nadine's cheeks. He said Knox deserved a chance to explain himself, maybe even make restitution. Said giving a man a chance to do right was the Christian thing to do. So he went to Knox with the evidence that night. Said he was going to meet Knox at the stockyard office, show him the ledger, and give him 24 hours to confess before Thomas took it to the authorities. Nadine's voice began to shake. I had such a bad feeling, Mr. Thorne. Thomas wasn't careful by nature, and I knew Knox was dangerous, so I followed him. The cabin fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through the eaves and the distant call of a night bird. Abel waited, sensing that the worst was yet to come. I hid outside the office window, Nadine continued. Knox was there waiting with 2 of his deputies, Morrison and Coates. They had Thomas surrounded before he even knew what was happening. What did you see? Knox was calm as ice, asking Thomas what he thought he'd found. My husband tried to explain, tried to show him the ledger, but Knox just smiled. That cold, empty smile he gets when he's about to do something terrible. Nadine's hands were shaking now, coffee sloshing in her cup. Knox said Thomas had caused enough trouble that some people were too stupid to mind their own business. Abel felt the familiar weight of dread settling in his chest. There's more. There's a loose board in the stockyard office floor, Mr. Thorne. Knox knew exactly where it was, walked right to it like he'd been there before. When he pulled it up, Nadine's voice cracked. Underneath is a hole that drops straight down into the old silver mine. Must be 60 feet to the bottom, nothing but rock and darkness. The abandoned mine. Every longtime resident of Dust Creek knew about the maze of tunnels and shafts that honeycombed the ground beneath the town. The silver had played out years ago, leaving behind a dangerous network of unstable passages and unmarked drops. More than one drunk or foolish child had vanished into those depths over the years. Knox pushed him. Nadine whispered. Just put his hands on Thomas's shoulders and pushed him like he was throwing out garbage. I heard him fall and then... nothing. Just silence. Abel closed his eyes, seeing the scene all too clearly. Thomas Hartwell, honest and trusting to the end, murdered by the very man he'd hoped to redeem. It was the kind of casual evil that made a mockery of justice and decency. Knox replaced the board like nothing had happened. Nadine continued. Told his deputies to spread word that Thomas Hartwell was a cattle thief who'd run off with his family's savings. Said if anyone asked questions, they should mention that Thomas had been acting nervous lately, probably planning his escape. Why didn't you go to the territorial authorities? With what proof the ledger was still in Thomas's hand when Knox pushed him? Even if I could have found someone to listen to me, it would have been my word against the sheriff's. Nadine's laugh was hollow. A hysterical widow making wild accusations against a respected lawman. Who would have believed me? Someone might have. Maybe. But Knox didn't give me the chance. The next day he had me arrested for vagrancy. Said I was spreading malicious lies about honest citizens, disturbing the peace, corrupting the moral character of the community. She gestured toward her sleeping daughters. That's when he decided to make an example of us. Public shame for the whole family, a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to question his authority. Abel stood and walked to the window, staring out at the star-filled desert. Somewhere out there, Knox was planning his next move. The sheriff couldn't let this challenge to his authority stand. Too much was at stake, too much money and power and carefully constructed lies. There's something else, Nadine said quietly. Something that might give us a chance. Abel turned back to face her. What? Thomas was paranoid about losing important documents. Always said never to put all your eggs in one basket. Hope flickered in her eyes for the first time since he'd found her tied to that fence. He made a copy of the ledger before he went to confront Knox. Hid it with someone he trusted, someone Knox couldn't intimidate or corrupt. Who? Father Miguel at the mission. Thomas said if anything happened to him, the priest would know what to do with the evidence. Nadine leaned forward, urgency creeping into her voice. If we could get word to Father Miguel, if we could convince him to take the ledger to the territorial authorities, Knox would never let us reach the mission. He's got men watching every road out of town. Then we make him come to us, Sylvie said suddenly. Both adults turned to stare at the girl who they'd assumed was asleep. But Sylvie's eyes were bright and alert, and her voice carried a determination that belied her years. What do you mean? Abel asked. Knox thinks he's got us trapped out here, right? Thinks we're helpless and scared, waiting for him to decide our fate. The girl's smile was sharp as a blade. But Papa always said the best way to catch a snake is to make it think it's caught you. Before Abel could ask what she meant, and the sound of approaching horses reached them, not the disorganized thunder of a mob, but the disciplined rhythm of men riding with purpose. Abel grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. But what he saw made his blood run cold. Knox wasn't coming with a lynch mob this time. He was coming with an army. 20 armed men surrounded Abel's cabin in the pale light of dawn, their horses snorting and stamping in the cool morning air. They'd approached with military precision, cutting off every avenue of escape before announcing their presence. Knox sat his horse at the center of the formation, his badge glinting in the early sunlight like a beacon of corrupted authority. Abel Thorne. The sheriff's voice carried clearly across the desert silence. "You're harboring known criminals. Send them out now, and maybe we can settle this peaceful like—" Abel crouched beside the broken window, his Winchester loaded and ready. But 20-1 were impossible odds, especially with a pregnant woman and 2 children to protect. The cabin offered some cover, but not enough to matter against that kind of firepower. "They ain't criminals, Knox," Abel called back. "They're a widow and her children, and they're under my protection. Your protection don't mean spit out here, Thorne. This is my territory and I make the rules." Behind Abel, Nadine was gathering her daughters close, whispering urgent instructions about staying low and keeping quiet. Opal was still weak from her fever, but her eyes were alert and frightened. Sylvie, meanwhile, was studying the cabin's interior with the calculating gaze of someone looking for advantages. "There's another way out," she whispered to Abel. "Mama, remember what you told me about the cellar?" Nadine's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "The tunnel," she breathed. Abel frowned. "What tunnel? Sarah never told you." Nadine seemed surprised. "When we first moved to Dust Creek, she mentioned that your cabin had been built over part of the old mine system. Said she'd reinforced a natural passage that led from the root cellar to the oak grove about half a mile east." The revelation hit Abel like a thunderbolt. Sarah had always been secretive about her construction projects, insisting on doing certain work herself, or with hired help while he was away on bounty hunts. He'd assumed it was just her independent nature, never imagining she was preparing for exactly this kind of emergency. "You're sure about this tunnel? Sarah drew me a map once, said it might come in handy if we ever had trouble with claim jumpers or Indians." Nadine's voice was urgent but controlled. "She made me promise to remember it said women had to look out for each other in country like this." Outside, Knox's patience was wearing thin. "I'm giving you one more chance, Thorne. Send out the criminals or we're coming in." Abel made his decision. "Get to the cellar," he whispered. "All of you. I'll buy you time to get through the tunnel." "What about you?" Sylvie asked. "I'll follow when I can. But someone has to slow them down, make them think we're all still here." Nadine gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Mr. Thorne, if Knox takes you alive, he'll torture you until you tell him where we've gone. And then he'll hunt us down like animals. Then I won't let him take me alive." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Abel had made his choice. He would sacrifice himself to save this family, just as he'd failed to sacrifice himself to save his own. "Time's up," Knox shouted. "Take the cabin." The first volley of gunfire shattered what remained of the windows, filling the air with splinters and dust. Abel returned fire, his shots carefully placed to suggest multiple defenders. He needed Knox's men to believe the entire family was trapped inside, fighting desperately for their lives. Behind him, he heard the trap door to the root cellar creak open. Nadine was helping her daughters down the wooden ladder, their movements quick but cautious. Every second counted now. Once Knox realized the cabin was nearly empty, he'd spread his men out to search the surrounding area. "We're not going without you," Sylvie said stubbornly. "Yes, you are." Abel's voice brooked no argument. "That ledger is the only thing that can bring Knox to justice. Your family's the only witness to Thomas's murder. You have to survive no matter what happens to me." Another burst of gunfire forced him to duck below the windowsill. When he looked up, he saw Knox's men beginning to move closer, using the desert scrub as cover. They were professionals coordinating their advance with hand signals and careful fire discipline. "Go," Abel hissed. Now, he heard the trapdoor close just as the first of Knox's men reached the cabin walls. Abel moved to the back window, firing rapidly to keep the attackers at bay. But he was running low on ammunition, and his position was becoming untenable. A flaming bottle crashed through the front window, spreading kerosene across the dry wooden floor. Smoke began to fill the cabin as the flames took hold, and Abel knew his time was running out. But every minute he could hold them here was another minute for Nadine and her daughters to escape through Sarah's secret tunnel. "Burn him out," Knox commanded. "I want this over with." More fire bottles followed the first, and soon the cabin was blazing like a torch. Abel retreated to the kitchen where the stone fireplace offered some protection from the smoke and flames. But the heat was becoming unbearable, and he could hear the roof timbers beginning to crack. Time to go. Abel fired his last rounds through the kitchen window and then threw his empty rifle aside. The root cellar entrance was already wreathed in smoke, but he could still reach it if he moved fast. He dropped through the trap door just as the kitchen ceiling collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning wood. The tunnel was narrow and low-carved through solid rock by miners who'd long since given up their dreams of wealth. Abel crawled forward in absolute darkness, following the path Sarah had prepared for emergencies he'd never imagined. Behind him, the sound of his burning cabin grew fainter, replaced by the whisper of moving air that suggested the tunnel was still sound. When he finally emerged into the oak grove, gasping and covered in soot, he found Nadine and her daughters waiting in the shade of the largest tree. They looked up as he appeared, relief flooding their faces. "Thought you weren't coming," Sylvie said, but her voice was shaky with emotion. "Promised I would," Abel replied, checking to make sure they were all unharmed. Sarah always said her tunnels were built to last. In the distance, they could see smoke rising from the ruins of the cabin. Knox's men would discover the tunnel soon enough, but for now, they had a brief respite. The question was what to do with it. "Where now?" Nadine asked. Abel looked around the grove, calculating distances and options. They needed shelter medical supplies for Opal, and some way to get word to Father Miguel. But most importantly, they needed to stay ahead of Knox's search parties. "There's an old line shack about 2 miles north of here," he said finally. "It's been abandoned for years, but it might still be sound. We can rest there while we figure out our next move." As they gathered their few possessions and prepared to move deeper into the wilderness, Abel caught sight of something that made his heart skip. In the distance, a lone rider was approaching the grove. Not one of Knox's men, but someone else entirely. Dr. Elias Crow reined in his horse at the edge of the trees, his medical bag clutched against his chest and guilt written across his weathered features. The doctor's eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion, and his hands shook as he dismounted. "Thank God you're alive," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been riding all night trying to find you before Knox did." "Why?" Abel asked suspiciously. "You're Knox's man." "I was," Crow admitted. "But not anymore. What he's planning to do to this family. There are lines even a broken man can't cross." He reached into his medical bag and withdrew a small bundle fever medicine, clean bandages, and a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of silver coins. "For the children," he said, offering the supplies to Nadine. "And for whatever comes next." As they stood in the dappled shade of the oak grove, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the desert, Abel felt the pieces of a larger game beginning to shift. Knox's power was built on fear and corruption, but it wasn't absolute. There were still good people in Dust Creek, still those willing to risk everything for the sake of justice. The question was whether that would be enough when the final reckoning came. Dr. Elias Crow's hands trembled as he examined little Opal in the filtered light of the oak grove. The child's fever had broken, but her breathing was still shallow, and her skin had the translucent quality that spoke of serious illness barely held at bay. She needs proper rest and nutrition, he said quietly to Nadine. The fever's broken, but her body's been through too much. Another shock like that could... He didn't finish the sentence. Could what? Sylvie demanded, her protective instincts flaring. Could kill her. Crow said simply. Children her age don't have much reserve. We need to get her somewhere safe, somewhere she can recover properly. Abel studied the doctor's face, searching for signs of deception. Why should we trust you? You've been Knox's creature for years. Because I'm tired of being a coward. Crow replied, his voice thick with self-loathing. Knox has had leverage over me for 3 years, knows about my weakness for laudanum. Said he'd expose me, ruin my practice unless I kept quiet about what went on in his jail cells. What did go on? The things that would make you sick to your stomach. Knox doesn't just arrest people, he breaks them, uses pain and humiliation to make them compliant, to ensure they'll never testify against him. Crow's hands clenched into fists. I've patched up more beaten prisoners than I care to count, signed more false death certificates than any decent man should. Nadine's face went pale. Death certificates, Chinese workers mostly. Knox has been using them in the old silver mine, practically slaves, working in conditions that would kill a strong man in months. When they get too sick or injured to work, they just disappear. The revelation hit them like a physical blow. Knox's corruption wasn't just about stolen cattle. It was about human lives, about systematic murder, disguised as industrial accidents. How many? Abel asked. Dozens, maybe more. Knox keeps them in a camp east of town, brings them up through the old mine shafts so nobody sees them coming and going. The ones who try to escape or make trouble. Crow shuddered. Let's just say the mine has claimed a lot of victims over the years. And you helped cover it up. I signed the papers Knox told me to sign, kept my mouth shut when I should have spoken up. I told myself I was just one man, that I couldn't fight the whole system. Crow looked at Opal's pale face. But watching that family tied to the fence, seeing what Knox was willing to do to innocent children, I can't do it anymore. A distant sound made them all freeze, the thunder of multiple horses moving fast across the desert. Knox's search parties spreading out from the burned cabin to scour the countryside for their escaped quarry. We need to move, Abel said urgently. That line shack I mentioned, it's our best chance for shelter. But as they prepared to leave the grove, another rider appeared through the trees. Deputy Lyle Morrison sat his horse at the edge of the clearing, his hand resting on his gun butt, but not drawing. The young man's face was haggard with sleepless guilt, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd seen too much. Doc, he said quietly, thought I might find you here. Morrison, Crow replied carefully. You here to arrest us? Don't know yet. Lyle's gaze moved to Nadine and her daughters, lingering on Opal's fevered face. Knox sent me to track you down, bring you back for questioning. But I heard what the woman said yesterday about Thomas Hartwell. What about it? Knox killed him, didn't he? Pushed him down that mine shaft like he was nothing. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Lyle Morrison was young, barely 25, and had worn a deputy's badge for less than 2 years. But he'd grown up in Dust Creek, knew right from wrong, and Abel could see the moral struggle playing out across his features. Yes, Nadine said simply. Knox murdered my husband in cold blood, then made up lies to cover his tracks. Lyle's face crumpled with shame. I helped spread those lies. Told people Thomas was a thief who'd run off with stolen money. I believed Knox when he said it was true, or maybe I just wanted to believe it because the alternative was too terrible to face. You were following orders, Dr. Crow said gently. We all were. Following orders don't make it right. Lyle's voice was thick with self-recrimination. I became a deputy to serve justice, not to help a killer maintain his power. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Abel knew they were running out of time. Morrison, you need to make a choice right now. Are you with Knox or are you with justice? The young deputy looked at Opal's pale face, at Sylvie's protective stance over her sister, at Nadine's quiet dignity in the face of unimaginable loss. When he spoke, his voice was steady with newfound resolve. I'm with justice. What do you need me to do? Help us get to the mission, Abel said. Father Miguel has evidence that can bring Knox down, but we need to reach him alive. Knox has got men watching all the roads. But there's an old Indian trail through the Badlands, rough going, but it might get you there unseen. What about you? I'll go back to town, try to throw Knox off your scent. Tell him I lost your trail in the rocks, buy you some time. Lyle's jaw tightened. And when the time comes, I'll testify to everything I know about Knox's crimes. As the deputy rode away, Abel led the small group deeper into the wilderness. The old line shack sat in a narrow canyon, its weathered walls barely visible against the red rock cliffs. It had been built by miners 20 years ago, abandoned when the silver played out, but the structure was still sound. Inside, they found the bare essentials of shelter, a stone fireplace, a few pieces of crude furniture, and walls thick enough to provide some protection from the elements. Dr. Crow immediately set about examining Opal more thoroughly, while Abel and Sylvie scouted the surrounding area for signs of pursuit. She's stable, Crow reported after his examination. But she needs rest, proper food, and time to recover. Moving her again too soon could be dangerous. We might not have a choice, Abel replied grimly. Knox won't give up easily. As if summoned by his words, the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the canyon. Someone was shooting, and the shots were coming from the direction of town. What's happening? Nadine asked. Abel climbed to the top of the canyon wall, using an old prospector's telescope he'd found in the shack to scan the horizon. What he saw made his blood run cold. Smoke was rising from several buildings in Dust Creek, and groups of armed men were moving through the streets with military precision. Knox is declaring martial law, he said when he returned to the shack. He's using our escape as an excuse to take complete control of the town. The implications were staggering. Knox wasn't just hunting them, he was using their flight as justification for a complete power grab. Anyone who opposed him would be branded a sympathizer. Anyone who questioned his authority would be arrested as a collaborator. We have to get word to the territorial authorities, Nadine said urgently. People need to know what's happening here. Knox has thought of that too, Abel replied. I saw his men setting up roadblocks on all the main routes. Nothing gets in or out of Dust Creek without his permission. But Sylvie had been studying the maps Dr. Crow had brought, tracing routes with her finger. What about the old Spanish trail? She asked. Papa used to talk about it, said it was the route the conquistadors used to reach the silver mines. That trail's been abandoned for decades, Crow said. Washed out in places blocked by rockfalls. It would be incredibly dangerous. More dangerous than staying here, Sylvie countered. Before anyone could answer, the sound of approaching horses reached them again. But this time, the riders weren't Knox's men. A lone figure on horseback was making his way up the canyon, moving slowly and carefully to avoid detection. Father Miguel emerged from the shadows like a ghost from the past. The old priest was well into his 70s, his white hair gleaming in the afternoon sun, but his eyes were bright with intelligence and determination. He rode a sturdy mule that picked its way carefully over the rocky ground, and a rifle rested across his saddle. Senora Hartwell, he said as he dismounted. Dr. Crow sent word that you might need assistance. Father. Nadine breathed relief, flooding her voice. Thank God you're here. I have been waiting for this day for weeks. The priest said solemnly, ever since your husband brought me certain documents. He said if anything happened to him, I should ensure they reach the proper authorities. You have the ledger. I have copies of everything, the financial records, the testimony Thomas prepared, even photographs of some of the forged documents. Father Miguel's voice grew heavy. Your husband was a thorough man, Senora. He knew the risks he was taking. Then we can expose Knox's crimes, Abel said. Bring him to justice. Perhaps. But first we must survive long enough to present the evidence. The priest's expression was grim. Knox's men have surrounded the mission. They claim to be searching for stolen property, but I know they're really looking for Thomas's records. Now, how did you escape? I have been traveling these mountains for 40 years, my son. I know paths that Knox's men have never seen. Father Miguel smiled slightly. The advantage of serving God in wild country, you learn to be very resourceful. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and gold, the small group huddled around a carefully concealed fire. Dr. Crow had prepared a simple meal from their limited supplies, and Opal was finally showing signs of improvement. The little girl was sitting up taking small sips of broth, and her eyes had lost their feverish brightness. We'll rest here tonight, Abel decided. Tomorrow we'll try to reach the territorial capital. Father Miguel, you know the old Spanish trail, like the back of my hand. It's treacherous, but it's our best chance of avoiding Knox's patrols. What about the people in town? Nadine asked. If Knox has declared martial law, they'll have to survive until we can bring help. Father Miguel said quietly. But there are good people in Dust Creek, people who won't stand for tyranny indefinitely. Knox's overplayed his hand fear only works when people believe they have no choice. As the night deepened, Abel took first watch while the others tried to rest. The desert was alive with sounds, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the whisper of wind through the rock formations. But underneath it all, he could hear something else. The steady rhythm of horses moving through the darkness. Knox's men were still out there, still searching. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Abel knew this was only the beginning. Knox wouldn't give up easily, and he had resources they couldn't match. The final confrontation was coming, and not all of them would survive it. But for now, they had hope. They had evidence. And they had each other. It would have to be enough. Dawn came gray and sullen over the Badlands, but the small group was already moving. Father Miguel led them along a narrow track that wound through towering red rock formations, a path so ancient it seemed carved by the hand of God himself. The going was treacherous, loose stones that could send a horse tumbling into the abyss, narrow ledges barely wide enough for a single rider's stretches where they had to dismount and lead their animals by hand. But it was taking them away from Knox's search parties, and that was worth any amount of risk. Opal rode double with her mother, her small arms wrapped around Nadine's waist. The child was much improved, though still weak from her ordeal. Sylvie had proven to be an excellent rider, handling her borrowed horse with the natural skill of someone raised in open country. Dr. Crow, despite his advancing years, kept up without complaint. And Abel brought up the rear, his eyes constantly scanning their back trail for signs of pursuit. How much further? Nadine asked as they paused to rest the horses in a narrow canyon. We're perhaps halfway to the territorial road, Father Miguel replied. But the worst of the trail is still ahead. There's a place called Devil's Backbone, a ridge barely 3 feet wide with drops of 1,000 feet on either side. Sounds charming, Abel muttered. The Spanish called it El Camino de la Muerte, the Road of Death. But it's the only way to avoid Knox's patrols. As they prepared to resume their journey, the sound of gunfire echoed off the canyon walls. Not close, but not far enough away for comfort. Knox's men were still out there, still hunting. We need to move faster, Abel said. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, following a trail that seemed to defy gravity, itself disaster struck. A section of the path had been undermined by recent rains, and as Dr. Crow's horse picked its way across the unstable ground, the edge gave way. The horse screamed as it fell, taking the doctor with it. Abel lunged forward, managing to grab Crow's wrist just as the man disappeared over the edge. For a moment, the doctor hung suspended over a drop that would have meant certain death, his medical bag tumbling into the abyss below. "Hold on." Abel grunted, his muscles straining as he fought to pull the heavier man back to safety. With Father Miguel's help, they managed to haul Dr. Crow back onto solid ground. But the doctor's leg was badly injured, probably broken, and their medical supplies had been lost with his horse. "I can't continue." Crow gasped, his face gray with pain. "Leave me here. Come back for me when you've delivered the evidence." "We don't leave anyone behind," Abel said firmly. "You have to. That little girl needs to reach safety, and every minute you delay increases the chance that Knox will catch you." But before Abel could argue further, a new voice cut through the morning air. Well, what do we have here?" Sheriff Knox stepped out from behind a boulder, his rifle trained on the group. Behind him came Deputy Morrison and 3 other men, all armed and ready for trouble. But there was something different about Morrison. His face was pale and his hands were shaking. "Thought you were clever, didn't you?" Knox's voice was calm, conversational. "Using the old Indian trails, avoiding my roadblocks. But you forgot one thing: I've been hunting men in these mountains for 20 years. "Knox," Abel said quietly, his hand moving slowly toward his gun. "Let the women and children go. Your quarrels with me." "My quarrels with anyone who threatens my authority," Knox replied. "You've caused me considerable trouble, Thorne. Made me look weak in front of my own men. You made yourself look weak when you started murdering innocent people." Knox's laugh was harsh as breaking glass. "Innocent Thomas Hartwell was a thief and a troublemaker. The Chinese workers were illegals who had no business being in my territory. And this family." He gestured toward Nadine and her daughters. "They're parasites who spread lies about honest lawmen. The only liar here is you." Nadine said, her voice steady despite the rifle pointed at her heart. "Is that so? Well, we'll see about that." Knox's eyes glittered with malice. "Morrison, search them. I want to see what evidence they think they have." But Deputy Morrison didn't move. His young face was etched with conflict, and his rifle remained pointed at the ground. "Morrison," Knox barked. "I gave you an order." "I can't do it, Sheriff," Morrison said quietly. "This is wrong. They're innocent people. They're criminals and traitors." "No, sir. They're victims of your crimes." Morrison's voice grew stronger. "I've seen the evidence, Sheriff. Dr. Crow showed me the photographs, the financial records. I know what you've been doing." Knox's face went purple with rage. "You treacherous little worm, I made you everything you are." "You made me a criminal," Morrison replied. "But I don't have to stay one." The confrontation hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Knox's other men were looking uncertain, unsure which way to jump. Their loyalty was to Knox's money and authority, but that authority was crumbling before their eyes. That's when Father Miguel spoke up, his aged voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "There is something you should know, Sheriff Knox. Something that changes everything." "What's that, old man?" Thomas Hartwell's ledger was not the only evidence he gathered. The priest's eyes were bright with righteous purpose. He also wrote detailed letters to the territorial governor, the Federal Marshal Service, and the military commander at Fort Garrison. Those letters were mailed 3 days before his death. Knox's face went white. "You're lying." "Am I? Then why do you think Deputy Morrison received orders yesterday to place you under arrest? Why do you think territorial marshals are already en route to Dust Creek?" The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Knox's empire wasn't just crumbling, it had already fallen. The federal authorities were coming, and there would be no escape this time. "You're finished, Knox." Abel said quietly. Your only choice now is how many more people you kill before they take you down. But Knox wasn't ready to surrender. With the desperation of a cornered animal, he swung his rifle toward Opal, the smallest and most vulnerable target. Maybe I can't escape, he snarled. But I can make sure you all pay for destroying me. That's when Deputy Morrison finally found his courage. His shot took Knox in the shoulder, spinning the sheriff around and sending his own shot wild. The bullet struck the canyon wall, sending chips of stone flying in all directions. Knox staggered, but didn't fall, his left arm hanging useless, but his right hand still gripping his pistol. His eyes were wild with pain and rage as he turned the weapon toward Morrison. Traitor, he screamed. I'll kill you for this. But Abel was already moving his own gun, clearing leather with the speed of a man who'd spent years hunting dangerous prey. The two shots came almost simultaneously, Knox's wild and desperate, Abel's calm and precise. Knox's bullet went wide, but Abel's found its mark. The corrupt sheriff crumpled to the rocky ground, his reign of terror finally ended. In the sudden silence that followed, then the only sounds were the whisper of wind through the canyon and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Justice had finally come to Dust Creek, but the cost had been higher than anyone had imagined. Is it over? Sylvie asked, her young voice barely above a whisper. It's over, Abel replied, holstering his gun. Knox is finished, and his men will face justice for their crimes. Deputy Morrison knelt beside his former boss, checking for signs of life. When he looked up, his face was grave. He's dead, Morrison announced. Sheriff Knox is dead. The words seemed to echo off the canyon walls, carrying with them the promise of a new beginning for Dust Creek and its people. But as Abel looked at the faces around him, Nadine holding her daughters close, Dr. Crow grimacing with pain, Father Miguel offering quiet prayers for the dead, he knew the real work was just beginning. Justice had been served, but justice was only the first step. Now came the harder task of rebuilding, of healing, of learning to trust again in a world where authority had been corrupted and innocence had been betrayed. But they would face that challenge together as a family bound not by blood, but by shared suffering and mutual salvation. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to build something better from the ashes of what Knox had destroyed. The death of Sheriff Knox should have meant the end of their troubles. But as Deputy Morrison helped Dr. Crow to his feet, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. Knox's remaining men, alerted by the gunfire, were closing in fast. How many? Abel asked, checking his ammunition. Morrison listened carefully to the sound of hoofbeats on stone. 6, maybe 8. Martin Coates is leading them. He's Knox's most loyal enforcer. Will they surrender when they see Knox is dead? Not Coates. He's got too much blood on his hands to face territorial justice. He'll fight to the end. Father Miguel was already helping Nadine and her daughters toward a narrow cleft in the canyon wall. There's a cave back here, he called. Small, but it might provide some cover. But as they moved toward the refuge, Abel realized their situation was even worse than he'd thought. Dr. Crow's broken leg made him unable to travel, and little Opal was showing signs of exhaustion from the morning's ordeal. They were trapped in a narrow canyon with limited ammunition and no way to escape. Morrison, Abel said quietly. You know these men. Is there any chance of reasoning with them? The young deputy's laugh was bitter. Coates has been Knox's attack dog for 5 years. He's killed more men than I can count, and he enjoys it. The only language he understands is violence. The first of Knox's men appeared at the mouth of the canyon, their rifles glinting in the harsh sunlight. Martin Coates sat his horse like a conquering general, his weathered face set in lines of cruel satisfaction. Knox, he called out. We heard shooting, you all right? When no answer came, Coates spurred his horse forward, his men spreading out behind him in a tactical formation. They moved with the precision of experienced killers, covering each other's advance with practiced ease. I can see bodies, one of the men reported. Looks like Knox is down. Coates's face darkened with rage. "Kill them all," he ordered. "No prisoners, no witnesses." The first shots echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, and Abel returned fire from behind a boulder. But they were badly outnumbered, and their position was becoming untenable. "We need to get deeper into the cave," he called to the others. "This position won't hold for long." But as they retreated toward the narrow cleft, disaster struck again. A ricochet caught Father Miguel in the chest, spinning the old priest around and dropping him to the rocky ground. Blood spread across his white shirt, and his breathing became labored and shallow. "Father!" Nadine cried, but Dr. Crow was already at the priest's side, his trained hands assessing the wound despite his own injury. "It's bad," Crow said quietly. "The bullet's near his heart. He needs surgery, and he needs it now. Can you—" "Not here. Not with these conditions." The doctor's face was grim. "He's dying, and there's nothing I can do to stop it." Father Miguel's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Abel with tremendous effort. "The evidence," he whispered. "In my saddlebags. You must get it to Santa Fe." "We will," Abel promised. "But you're going to be fine, Father. Just hold on." The old priest's smile was peaceful despite his pain. "I have walked with God for 70 years, my son. I am ready to go home." His hand moved to the silver crucifix around his neck, pressing it into Abel's palm. "For the children," he whispered. "So they remember that good still exists in this world." Father Miguel's eyes closed for the last time, and his breathing ceased. The man who had served God and justice for 4 decades was gone, another victim of Knox's legacy of violence. "He saved us," Sylvie said, tears streaming down her young face. "He died saving us." "Then we better make sure his sacrifice means something," Abel replied grimly. The gunfire from the canyon mouth was intensifying, and Coates's men were advancing steadily. They had the advantage of numbers, position, and ammunition, while Abel's group was trapped with a wounded doctor, a traumatized family, and dwindling supplies. But sometimes desperation breeds innovation. As Abel studied their situation, he remembered something from his bounty hunting days, a technique he'd learned from an old Apache tracker named Gray Wolf. "The cave," he said suddenly. "How deep does it go?" "I don't know," Morrison replied. "Never been inside it?" Father Miguel mentioned these canyons are connected to the old mine system. If this cave links to the tunnels, we might be able to escape underground. Dr. Crow finished understanding immediately. "But it's incredibly dangerous. Those mine shafts are unstable and most of them haven't been mapped." "More dangerous than staying here." Before anyone could answer, Coates's voice boomed across the canyon. "You're all going to die," he shouted. "Knox was like a father to me, and you murdered him in cold blood. I'm going to make you pay for that." A fresh volley of gunfire forced them deeper into the cave. The passage was narrow and twisted, carved by centuries of water flow through the limestone. But as they moved deeper, Abel felt a faint current of air against his face, a sign that the cave connected to a larger system. "There's a way out," he said with growing excitement. "The air's moving, which means there's another entrance somewhere." They pressed forward through the darkness, feeling their way along the rough walls. Behind them, they could hear Coates's men entering the cave, their voices echoing off the stone walls. "They're in here somewhere," Coates snarled. "Find them!" The chase was on, and Abel knew they were running out of time. But as they rounded a bend in the passage, a faint glimmer of light appeared ahead, daylight filtering down from somewhere above. "It's a shaft," Morrison said, studying the opening. "Goes straight up about 30 feet. Can we climb it?" "I can," Sylvie said suddenly. "I'm the lightest, and I've been climbing rocks since I could walk. If I can get to the top, maybe I can find a way to get you all out." "It's too dangerous." Nadine protested. "You're just a child." "I'm the only one who can do it," Sylvie replied with determination beyond her years. "Papa always said sometimes you have to do what scares you most." Before anyone could stop her, the girl was already climbing her small hands and feet, finding purchase on the rough stone walls. She moved with the natural agility of youth, ascending the narrow shaft like a human spider. Minutes passed like hours as they waited in the darkness below. The sound of pursuing voices grew louder, and Abel knew Coates's men were closing in. Then suddenly, Sylvie's voice echoed down from above. "I found something," she called. "There's a rope ladder hidden up here, and it leads to a mining platform. Can you lower it?" Already, the rope ladder tumbled down the shaft, and Abel immediately began organizing their escape. Dr. Crow would go first, despite his injury, followed by Nadine with baby Opal, then Morrison. Abel would bring up the rear, ready to hold off Coates's men if they were discovered. One by one, they climbed toward the light. The ascent was treacherous, especially for Dr. Crow with his broken leg, but determination and desperation drove them upward. When Abel finally reached the top, he found himself on a wooden platform built into the side of the mountain, part of the old mining operation that had been abandoned decades ago. "Which way?" he asked Sylvie, who had been scouting while the others climbed. "There's a trail that leads down the other side of the mountain," she reported. "It's steep, but it connects to the main road about 5 miles from here." They were almost free. But as they prepared to descend the trail, the sound of gunfire erupted from the cave below. Coates had discovered the shaft, and his men were already beginning to climb. "No move," Abel ordered. "Everyone down the trail now." The descent was harrowing, with loose stones and steep drops threatening to send them tumbling into the abyss. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that death was literally climbing up behind them. When they finally reached the main road, they found something that made Abel's heart leap with hope. A group of federal marshals led by a tall man with a silver star on his vest and steel in his eyes. "Marshal Hayes," Morrison called out, recognizing the federal officer. "Thank God you're here." "Deputy Morrison," Hayes replied formally. "I've been looking for you. There are some serious charges pending against Sheriff Knox and his organization." "Oh, Knox is dead," Abel reported. "Shot while resisting arrest. But his men are still pursuing us, and they're armed and dangerous." As if summoned by his words, the first of Coates's men appeared on the trail above them, rifle in hand. The final confrontation was about to begin, and this time there would be no escape for either side. Marshal Hayes and his deputies took cover behind their horses, weapons ready. "You men on the trail," Hayes shouted. "This is the United States Marshal Service. Throw down your weapons and surrender." Coates's answer was a rifle shot that sparked off the rocks near Hayes's head. The battle was joined, and the sound of gunfire echoed across the mountains like thunder. But this time, justice had the advantage. The federal marshals were professionals, disciplined, and well-trained. Coates's men, for all their experience with intimidation and murder, were not prepared for a real fight against determined lawmen. The battle was brief, but decisive. When the smoke cleared, 3 of Coates's men lay dead on the trail, and the others had thrown down their weapons in surrender. Coates himself sat propped against a boulder, clutching a wounded arm and glaring at his captors with unrepentant hatred. "It's over," Marshal Hayes announced. "Martin Coates, you're under arrest for murder conspiracy and about a dozen other federal crimes." As the surviving criminals were shackled and led away, Abel felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he'd been carrying for months. Knox's reign of terror was truly finished, and justice had finally come to Dust Creek. But the cost had been high. Father Miguel was dead, Dr. Crow was seriously injured, and a dozen good men had died in the fighting. The victory felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge of what it had taken to achieve it. "What happens now?" Nadine asked, holding her children close. "Now we rebuild," Marshal Hayes replied. The territorial government is sending administrators to take control of Dust Creek, and there will be a full investigation of Knox's crimes. Justice will be served, and the innocent will be protected. As they began the journey back to town, Abel reflected on the events of the past few days. He'd set out to save a family from injustice, and in doing so, he'd found something he thought he'd lost forever: a sense of purpose, a reason to keep fighting a family worth protecting. The wooden knife pressed warm against his ribs, Sarah's final gift to him. But now, it no longer represented failure and loss. Now, it was a symbol of love that endured, of second chances granted of the family he'd chosen, and the one that had chosen him in return. The road ahead would be difficult. There would be trials and investigations, rebuilding and healing. But they would face it together, united by shared suffering and mutual salvation. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to build something better from the ashes of Knox's corruption. The territorial courthouse in Santa Fe was packed beyond capacity on the day of the trials. Men and women from across the territory had come to witness justice being served, to see the end of the Knox regime that had terrorized the region for years. The evidence was overwhelming: Father Miguel's carefully preserved documents, the testimony of survivors, and the confessions of former Knox associates who had chosen cooperation over the hangman's noose. But the most compelling witness was a 10-year-old girl named Sylvie Hartwell, who took the stand with the composure of someone far beyond her years. "Tell the court what you saw the night your father died," the prosecutor asked gently. Sylvie's voice was clear and strong as she recounted the events that had started it all. "Mama followed Papa to the stockyard because she was worried about him. She saw Sheriff Knox push Papa down into the mine shaft. She saw him die." The defense attorney, a man hired by Knox's surviving associates, tried to discredit her testimony. "You're very young, Miss Hartwell. Are you certain you understand the difference between truth and fantasy?" Sylvie's eyes flashed with anger. "I understand the difference between right and wrong, sir. I understand that Sheriff Knox murdered my father because Papa found out about his stealing. And I understand that you're trying to make people think a little girl can't tell the truth." The courtroom erupted in murmurs of approval, and the judge had to call for order. It was clear that Sylvie's testimony had struck home with the jury. Deputy Lyle Morrison testified next, his voice steady, despite the weight of his own guilt. He detailed Knox's crimes with clinical precision: the stolen cattle, the murdered Chinese workers, the systematic corruption that had infected every aspect of law enforcement in Dust Creek. "Why did you finally decide to come forward?" the prosecutor asked. "Because I took an oath to serve justice," Morrison replied. "I forgot that oath for a while, let fear and weakness make me complicit in terrible crimes. But watching that family suffer for telling the truth, I couldn't be part of it anymore." Dr. Crow, testifying from a wheelchair due to his injuries, provided the medical evidence that corroborated the prosecution's case. He had signed false death certificates, treated victims of Knox's brutality, and kept silent about crimes that should have been reported to higher authorities. "I was a coward," he admitted to the court. "Knox had leverage over me, knowledge of my addiction to laudanum that he used to ensure my compliance. But being a coward doesn't excuse what I did. I helped cover up murders, and innocent people died because of my silence." The defense tried to argue that Knox's men had been following legitimate orders, that they had believed they were serving the law. But the evidence was too overwhelming, the testimony too compelling. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their verdicts. Martin Coates guilty on all counts, sentenced to hang. The surviving members of Knox's inner circle guilty of conspiracy murder and federal crimes, sentences ranging from life in prison to death. The Chinese workers who had been enslaved in the mines were freed and given passage to San Francisco, where they could rejoin their families or start new lives. The money Knox had stolen was recovered and distributed to his victims, including a substantial sum that went to Thomas Hartwell's widow and children. But the most important outcome was the appointment of a new sheriff for Dust Creek Deputy Lyle Morrison, who had proven his commitment to justice through his testimony and his willingness to face the consequences of his past actions. "I know I don't deserve this badge," Morrison said at his swearing-in ceremony. "But I promise you this, I will spend every day of my life trying to earn it. Justice will be served fairly and equally in this county, regardless of wealth or position." Abel Thorne stood at the back of the courthouse, watching the ceremony with quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, the corrupt had been punished, and the innocent had been vindicated. It was more than he had dared hope for when he first untied those ropes at the fence post, but his satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge of what it had cost. Father Miguel was dead, along with too many others who had stood up to Knox's tyranny. The victory was real, but it had been purchased with blood and sacrifice. As the crowd began to disperse, Nadine approached him with her children. Little Opal was fully recovered now, her cheeks pink with health and her eyes bright with curiosity. Baby Thomas was growing strong and healthy, already showing signs of his father's determined spirit. "What will you do now?" Nadine asked. Abel had been thinking about that question for weeks. The bounty hunting life had lost its appeal. Too much violence, too much loneliness, too much time spent in the company of the worst humanity had to offer. But the thought of returning to his empty ranch, to the hollow echoes of a life that had ended 15 years ago, was equally unappealing. "I've been thinking about that," he said slowly. "The territorial government's offering land grants to settlers willing to help rebuild the area. Good land suitable for ranching or farming. That sounds like a fine opportunity." "It is. But a ranch is a lot of work for one man. Needs a family to make it prosper, to make it feel like home." Abel's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes held a question he didn't quite know how to ask. Sylvie, who had been listening to the conversation with the acute awareness that children possess, spoke up before her mother could respond. "Are you asking us to be your family, Mr. Thorne?" The directness of the question caught Abel off guard. Well, I suppose I am, in a way." "Good," Sylvie said with satisfaction, "because we already decided we were keeping you." Nadine laughed, the first truly carefree sound Abel had heard from her. "My daughter has a point. We've been through too much together to go our separate ways now. It wouldn't be charity," Abel said quickly. "It would be a partnership. We'd work the land together, build something good from what Knox destroyed." "I'd like that," Nadine said simply. "Thomas would have liked it too. He always said the best families are the ones you choose." As they walked out of the courthouse together, Abel felt the wooden knife press warm against his ribs. Sarah's gift to him, carried through 15 years of grief and guilt, no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it had become a bridge between the family he'd lost and the one he'd found. The sun was setting over Santa Fe, painting the adobe buildings in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and the hard work of building a life together. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Abel Thorne felt at peace. Justice had been served. Family had been found. And hope, that most fragile of human emotions, had been rekindled in the ashes of tragedy. 6 months after the trials, the rebuilt town of Dust Creek bore little resemblance to the place Knox had ruled through fear and corruption. New businesses had opened, honest men held positions of authority, and the streets were safe for families to walk without fear. The old Thorne Ranch had been transformed as well. What had once stood empty and hollow now bustled with life and purpose. Abel and Nadine had married in a simple ceremony at the rebuilt church, with Sylvie and Opal as flower girls, and baby Thomas gurgling happily in his basket. Dr. Crow, fully recovered from his injuries, had performed the medical examination required by territorial law, and Deputy Sheriff Morrison had stood as Abel's best man. The ranch itself was thriving. They'd added cattle and horses, planted crops that could survive in the harsh desert climate. and built additional structures to accommodate their growing family. Abel's skills as a tracker and hunter complemented Nadine's practical knowledge of farming and household management, while the children brought energy and joy to every task. "It's hard to believe it's only been a year," Nadine said, as she sat in Sarah's rocking chair nursing their newest addition, a daughter they'd named Hope, born just 3 months earlier. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime." Abel replied, watching Sylvie teach Opal to ride the gentle mare they'd bought for the children. "Other times it feels like yesterday that I found you tied to that fence." The trials and their aftermath had brought closure to many of the territory's problems. The Chinese workers who had survived Knox's mines were now free men, many of them choosing to stay in the area and start businesses of their own. A small Chinatown had sprung up on the edge of Dust Creek, adding diversity and prosperity to the community. Deputy Sheriff Morrison had proven himself an honest and capable lawman, earning the respect of citizens who had learned to fear authority under Knox's regime. He'd married the schoolteacher, a young woman named Elizabeth, who had come west to bring education to the frontier, and they were expecting their first child in the spring. Dr. Crow had opened a proper medical practice serving not just Dust Creek, but the surrounding ranches and settlements. His experience with Knox's victims had taught him the importance of speaking up when he witnessed injustice, and he'd become a respected voice for reform in territorial medical practices. "There's something I want to show you," Abel said to Nadine as the sun began to set over their land. He led her to a small rise behind the house where he'd been working in secret for the past month. There, carved from local stone and surrounded by wildflowers, stood a memorial to those who had died in the struggle against Knox's corruption. "Thomas Hartwell," Nadine read aloud, running her fingers over the carefully carved letters. "Father Miguel Rodriguez, Mary Chen, Joseph Running Bear." The list went on, including every victim they could identify, both those who had died recently and those who had perished over the years of Knox's rule. "So they won't be forgotten," Abel said quietly. "So their sacrifices will mean something to future generations." Tears streamed down Nadine's face, but they were good tears, tears of gratitude and remembrance rather than despair. Thomas would have loved this. He always said the most important thing was to be remembered for trying to do right. As they stood together in the fading light, their children playing nearby, and their newest daughter sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, Abel felt the completion of a circle that had begun 15 years ago with loss and ended now with love. The wooden knife still rested in his pocket, but its meaning had transformed completely. Where once it had represented failure and guilt, now it symbolized continuity and hope. Sarah's love had not died with her. It had been passed down, transformed, and multiplied through the family they had built together. 2 years later, Abel stood on the porch of the house he'd built for Sarah, and now shared with the family he'd chosen. The desert stretched away in all directions, harsh and beautiful and eternal. But it no longer felt empty. It felt like home. Sylvie, now 12, had grown into a young woman of remarkable strength and wisdom. She helped manage the ranch's finances, having inherited her father's head for numbers, and tutored younger children in reading and arithmetic. Her experiences had marked her, but they had also forged her into someone who would never be a victim again. Opal, 8 years old and healthy as a desert wildflower, had become the family's source of endless energy and joy. She rode like a Comanche, could track small game through rocky terrain, and had a gift for finding humor in even the darkest situations. The fever that had nearly killed her had left no lasting effects except perhaps a deeper appreciation for each day of life. Baby Thomas was walking now, a sturdy toddler with his father's determined jaw and his mother's gentle eyes. He would grow up knowing stories of the father he'd never met, but he would also know the love of the man who had chosen to raise him as his own son. Little Hope was crawling everywhere, exploring her world with the fearless curiosity of a child who had never known want or danger. She would grow up in a world where justice was more than just a word, where authority served the people rather than oppressing them. and Nadine had blossomed into the woman she was always meant to be. The shadow of grief would always be part of her, but it no longer defined her. She was Abel's partner in every sense of the word, his equal in strength and wisdom, his complement in all things. "Abel," she called from the kitchen window. "Marshal Hayes is riding up the drive." Abel looked up to see the federal marshal approaching on his monthly visit. Hayes had become a friend over the past 2 years, and his visits were always welcome. But there was something different about his posture today, something that suggested important news. Marshal Abel greeted him as he dismounted. "Good to see you." "Abel, Mrs. Thorne." Hayes tipped his hat to Nadine, who had come out to join them. "I've got some news I thought you'd want to hear." "Good news or bad news?" "Good, I think. The territorial governor is recommending statehood for New Mexico. Says communities like Dust Creek prove that law and order can take root even in the wildest country." It was momentous news. Statehood would mean better roads, more schools, increased trade and prosperity. It would mean the rule of law was truly established, that the chaos and corruption of the territorial period was finally ending. "There's something else," Hayes continued. "The governor wants to recognize the people who made this transformation possible. There's going to be a ceremony in Santa Fe, and your family is specifically invited." "What kind of ceremony?" Nadine asked. "The kind where they give out medals and make speeches about courage and justice. The kind where they try to turn ordinary people into heroes." Abel shook his head immediately. "We're not heroes, Marshal. We just did what had to be done." "That's exactly what makes you heroes," Hayes replied with a smile. "Heroes never think they're heroes. They just do the right thing because it needs doing." As the marshal prepared to leave, he had one final surprise. "Almost forgot," he said, reaching into his saddlebags. "Found something that belongs to you." He pulled out a small wooden box, weathered with age, but still beautiful. Abel recognized it immediately. It had belonged to Sarah, a jewelry box her mother had given her as a wedding gift. "Where did you find this?" "In the ruins of Knox's house." Apparently, he'd been collecting trophies from people he'd destroyed over the years. There were dozens of items, photographs, jewelry, personal effects. This one had your wife's name carved inside the lid. Abel opened the box with trembling hands. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was Sarah's wedding ring, the one he'd thought lost forever when she died. Beside it was a small photograph he'd never seen before, showing Sarah holding their baby daughter in the garden behind their original cabin. "How?" Abel's voice was thick with emotion. "Knox had a photographer document some of his activities. This must have been taken shortly before they died. The photographer kept copies of everything hidden away in case he ever needed insurance against Knox's wrath." Abel stared at the photograph, seeing his wife and daughter as they had been in life, happy, healthy, full of love and hope for the future. It was a gift beyond price, a glimpse of joy from a time before tragedy struck. But as he studied the image more closely, something caught his attention. In the background, barely visible, but definitely there was a second small figure, another child, older than Mary, playing near the garden fence. "Marshal," Abel said slowly, "this photograph, when was it taken?" Hayes checked his notes. "According to the photographer's records, about 2 weeks before the fever epidemic." "Why?" Abel's heart began to race. The child in the background was too old to be Mary, who had been barely 2 when she died. And Sarah had never mentioned another child, never spoken of any family member Abel hadn't known about. "Mrs. Thorne," Hayes said to Nadine, noticing Abel's confusion. "You mentioned once that your husband had a sister who moved east before the war. Did she ever have children?" "Thomas mentioned a nephew once," Nadine said thoughtfully. "Said the boy's parents died in a cholera outbreak back in Kansas, and Thomas had been trying to find him. But that was years ago. The pieces of a puzzle 15 years in the making began to fall into place. Abel studied the photograph more intently, and suddenly he saw it and the familiar set of the jaw, the shape of the eyes, the way the child held himself. "My God," he whispered, "it's not possible." But even as he spoke the words, he knew it was true. The child in the photograph bore an unmistakable resemblance to Thomas Hartwell and to Sylvie, who carried her father's features as well as his determination. "What is it?" Nadine asked, alarmed by the expression on his face. Abel showed her the photograph, pointing to the background figure. "Look at this child. Really look." Nadine studied the image, and her face went white with shock. That could be Thomas as a boy. But how? "Marshal," Abel said urgently, "I need to see all of Knox's files, everything he kept about the people he destroyed." Hayes nodded grimly. "I'll have them brought to you." "But Abel, you need to prepare yourself. Knox kept records on a lot of people, and not all of the stories have happy endings." As the marshal rode away, Abel sat on his porch with the photograph in his hands, his mind reeling with possibilities. Could it be that Sarah had taken in Thomas's orphaned nephew without telling him? Could the boy have survived the fever that killed Sarah and Mary? And if so, what had happened to him? The answers came 3 days later when Marshal Hayes returned with a wagon full of Knox's personal files. Hidden among the documents was a folder labeled Thorn Property Seizure that contained records Abel had never seen before. The truth, when it emerged, was both heartbreaking and miraculous. Sarah had indeed taken in Thomas Hartwell's orphaned nephew, a boy named David, just weeks before Abel left on his final bounty hunt. She hadn't told him because she wanted to surprise him with their expanded family when he returned. When the fever struck, David had been the first to fall ill. Sarah had sent him to stay with a neighbor family, hoping to prevent the disease from spreading to Mary. But David had recovered, and when he returned to find Sarah and Mary dead and Abel gone, Knox had stepped in. The corrupt sheriff had claimed the boy as an abandoned orphan and sent him east on the orphan train, pocketing the money the territorial government paid for such humanitarian services. David Hartwell had grown up in an orphanage in St. Louis, never knowing his true identity or that he had family who would have loved him. But the most miraculous discovery was yet to come. Among Knox's papers was a letter dated just 6 months earlier, a letter from David Hartwell, now 17 years old, asking for information about his origins and whether he had any living relatives in New Mexico territory. Knox had never answered the letter, but Abel would. The reunion took place on a crisp October morning, with the desert air clear as crystal and the mountains painted in shades of gold and red. David Hartwell stepped off the stagecoach from Santa Fe, a young man of 17 with Thomas's strong features and Sarah's gentle eyes. He was taller than Abel had expected, lean and strong from years of hard work, but there was something unmistakably familiar about the way he carried himself. When he smiled, Abel saw Sarah's expression looking back at him across 15 years of separation and grief. "Mr. Thorne." David's voice was deeper than expected, but it carried the same careful politeness that Thomas had always shown. "I got your letter, David." Abel stepped forward, uncertain how to greet this young man, who was both a stranger and family. We're glad you came." The introductions were awkward at first. David had lived his entire conscious life believing he was alone in the world, and the sudden appearance of a family was overwhelming. But Sylvie, with the wisdom that came from her own experiences with loss and recovery, took charge of the situation. "You're my cousin," she announced with typical directness. "That makes you family, and in this family, we take care of each other." David's eyes filled with tears he'd held back for too many years. "I've been looking for family my whole life. I never thought." "You're home now," Nadine said gently, "if you want to be." The answer was written in David's face long before he spoke it aloud. Yes, yes, I want to be home. Over the following weeks, the pieces of David's story emerged. He'd been a bright student at the orphanage, good with numbers and languages, but always haunted by questions about his origins. When he'd turned 16, he'd been apprenticed to a merchant in St. Louis, but he'd never stopped wondering about the family he'd lost. Knox's letter, or rather the absence of Knox's letter, had been the final clue that led him to contact the territorial government directly. Marshal Hayes had connected him with Abel, and the rest was a reunion 15 years in the making. "I remember her," David said one evening as they sat around the dinner table. "Sarah, I mean. Not clearly, but I remember someone with gentle hands who sang lullabies and made me feel safe. I never understood why that memory felt so real when I'd been told I had no family." "She loved children," Abel said quietly. "Would have taken in every orphan in the territory if she could have. Taking care of you gave her joy, even at the end." As autumn turned to winter, David settled into the rhythm of ranch life. He had his Uncle Thomas's head for numbers and his Aunt Sarah's way with animals. More importantly, he had found his place in a family that had been built on love, rather than blood, on choice, rather than chance. The final surprise came on Christmas morning when Abel gathered the family around the fireplace for the exchange of gifts. He'd saved the most important one for last, a small wooden box he'd carved himself decorated with intricate patterns that matched Sarah's original knife. "This is for all of us," he said, opening the box to reveal its contents. "So we never forget where we came from or how far we've traveled together." Inside the box were tokens representing each member of their chosen family. Sarah's wedding ring, representing the love that had started it all. A pressed wildflower from Opal's recovery, representing hope in the face of despair. A small piece of the ledger that had brought Thomas justice, representing the courage to stand up for truth. A baby's rattle Hope had outgrown, representing new life and new beginnings. And at the bottom of the box, worn smooth by years of carrying, lay the wooden knife Abel had carved for Sarah during their brief season of happiness. But now it was no longer a symbol of loss and guilt. Now it was a reminder that love endures, that families can be rebuilt from the ashes of tragedy, and that sometimes the most broken people are exactly the ones meant to save each other. "Every family needs an origin story," Abel said as they passed the box around each person, holding the tokens and feeling their weight of memory and meaning. "This is ours. Not perfect, not without pain, but real and lasting." Outside, snow began to fall, rare in the desert, but not unknown. The flakes drifted down like blessings, covering the harsh landscape in a blanket of pristine white. Inside the house that love had built twice over a family gathered around their fire, safe and warm and whole. David would stay, of course. He would help build the ranch into something that could support them all. Would court the banker's daughter in town, would eventually add his own children to the family tree. Sylvie would become a teacher, carrying on the tradition of education and justice that had saved them all. Opal would grow up to be a healer, following in Dr. Crow's footsteps, but surpassing his achievements. Thomas would become a lawman like Sheriff Morrison, dedicated to ensuring that justice was served fairly and equally. Hope would become an artist, painting the desert landscapes that had been the backdrop to their family's redemption. But all of that was in the future. Tonight they were simply a family gathered around a fire, sharing stories and dreams, and the quiet contentment that comes from knowing you are loved and safe and home. The wooden knife lay warm in its box, no longer carried in Abel's pocket, but treasured as the family heirloom it had always been meant to be. Sarah's love lived on, not in grief and guilt, but in the laughter of children and the strength of bonds forged in hardship and sealed in joy. Justice had been served. Family had been found, and love, that most powerful and enduring of human emotions, had conquered fear, hatred, and the cruel indifference of a harsh world. In Dust Creek, the story was complete. But the love that had written it would continue for generations to come, passed down like the wooden knife itself, a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances can change the world one act of courage at a time. The desert wind sang its ancient song outside their windows, wild and free and unafraid. And for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, it sounded like hope.